Thank you, all of you, for joining us here today for this very interesting panel. I'm going to very briefly introduce each of the panelists who will be giving some initial general remarks about the topic at hand, and then we will move on to a moderated Q&A. Hopefully, we will also have the chance and the time to have an exchange with the audience, both here in person and virtually. So joining us virtually is Marilyn van Deelen, who is the EU Special Envoy for Space. Then we also have Ambassador Shen Jian. He is the Ambassador for Disarmament Affairs, Deputy Permanent Representative of the Permanent Mission of the People's Republic of China to the United Nations Office at Geneva and other international organizations in Switzerland. We also have Clive Hughes, Head of Space Security and Advanced Threats from the United Kingdom's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. We also have Claudio Leopoldino, Councillor for the Permanent Delegation of Brazil to the Conference on Disarmament. Also, Konstantin Vorontsov, who is the Deputy Director of the Department for Non-Proliferation and Arms Control from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation. And last but not least, Emily Esbenz, who is the Desk Officer for Space at the Department of Nuclear Disarmament and Non-Proliferation from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of France. So maybe we could start with Marilyn, who is joining us virtually. The floor is yours, Marilyn. Please take it away.
I would much rather have liked to be with you in Geneva, in that room that looks very filled with lots of people. And I'm here surrounded by empty chairs. And also joining you and my esteemed co-panelists. Also because you put together a fabulous program for this conference. So I'm sorry to miss out on that, but I'll make sure I'll be there next time. And I'm also happy that we could make this work virtually, but I realize it's cumbersome, so please bear with me. I'd also like to congratulate André Kwok, because you ran a little bit late, I had the opportunity to listen into his comments and see the video. I really appreciate you including the voice of youth in the program of the conference. And his remarks on regional cooperation and on space literacy were really important. But for my initial remarks, I would like to make a few points. In the EU, we are very keen on the substantial work, the open-ended working group. There is now a window of opportunity to fulfill the ambitious goals that were set in the group's mandate. And what is key to us is that the result of this open-ended working group process is a synthesis of approaches, rather than one trying to defeat the other approach. We need to accept that LBIs and rules, norms, and principles of responsible behavior are complementary and they do not exclude each other. So I'd like to unpack that a little bit. While LBIs are the skeleton of the governance of space security, legal norms are too abstract to regulate all kinds of behavior. General elements used by them, as for example, due regard or good faith, need to be further complemented for a more accurate and more realistic guidance. Guidelines, principles, and other non-legally binding norms, together with other instruments, such as, for example, collections of best practice, serve precisely this goal. Furthermore, when we say prevention of an arms race in outer space, we still tend to think about actual sophisticated weapon systems with sensors, projectiles, and warheads in orbit, while the contemporary reality is quite different. Not a single bullet needs to be fired from a conventional weapon in order to disrupt or incapacitate space assets. Any fake accident with another space object, or even by non-kinetic interference, will be able to inflict the same damage. And the consequences to our societies of such an accident will be severe, as we depend more and more on space-based data and services for all of our economies and the well-being of our societies. As almost any element of peaceful civilian space technology can be used to cause harm by falling in the wrong hands or used in the wrong way, A simple ban on the placement of weapons in space will not increase our security. Therefore, we rather need to focus on the behavior of turning an object or a technology that is originally destined for a peaceful purpose into a weapon by using it in a malicious way. Without identifying and separating hostile and friendly, or malicious and responsible behaviors, it is impossible to prevent intentional wrongdoing in outer space. So if we reduce the question of powers to maintaining strategic balance between great powers in a sense of the 20th century arms control, and if we act according to those instincts, we will remain vulnerable to a growing number of space threats. Therefore, we prefer the more holistic, balanced approach where all means of reducing threats are discussed. And that is what this synthesis of different narratives in the open-end working group on perils in all its aspects, what that will mean for us and what we are working for in the EU. Synthesis is hardly possible without the balance of different elements in the discussion. So therefore, I'd like to reiterate the importance of an inclusive and balanced approach in the open-ended working group. Now, given the amount of work to be done and the challenges before us, we need to improve on the pace of our work. We have seen the pace of the work that we saw this year, and we need to really make full use of the upcoming substantial sessions in 2026 to have in-depth discussions and to make progress. With those initial remarks, I want to thank you again and very much look forward to the discussions.
Thank you very much, Marilyn, for those remarks. I really liked the point that you made, especially on the complementarity of different approaches and how we have an opportunity with this OEWD to bring those different perspectives together. I'm going to hand it over to Ambassador Shen for his general remarks. Please, Ambassador.
Thank you, Abdina, and thank you, Special Envoy Van Dielen, and you seem to be far away from space. And I think we didn't catch you in the video very clearly. It struck me that last week we were discussing these autonomous weapon systems. We are discussing distinction between identification, selection, and engagement. Now I see the difference between identification and the selection. Also, congratulations, Mr. Guo. Space literacy is really very important. And in this regard, I really want to thank UNIDIA for organizing this event. And we hope that everyone here will continue to support UNIDIA's role as a research center and training center, as especially we are under the pressure of UN80 reform. And the message is very clear. UNIDIA plays a very important role. We hope that we'll continue to do so. And I'm also glad that I'm joined by many distinguished professors from famous Chinese universities here. I hope that they will take this opportunity to express space literacy. I'll come back to the theme. As the theme of the panel points out, there are evolving approaches to space security and perils. For quite some time, we have been exploring different approaches to perils, international law-based approaches vis-a-vis rules-based approaches. That is legally binding measures or non-legally binding instruments, or Professor Wang always want to say hard laws or soft laws. I need to cut short of my statements. I would like to take this opportunity to share briefly 3 observations in this regard. Firstly, we should uphold the rule of international law as the fundamental safeguard for space security. Soft laws can only serve as supplements to hard laws and should neither be a substitute to or prerequisite for the negotiation of a legally binding instrument. In the absence of hard laws, or where such laws have loopholes, non-legally binding measures such as political commitments, voluntary norms, and transparency and confidence measures cannot fundamentally prevent an arms race in outer space and may even prove to be counterproductive. On this point, I might have different views with Special Envoy Van Dielen just mentioned. The formulation of relevant soft laws may evolve into establishing rules of engagement or rules for regulating development and use of space weapons. That is quite dangerous from the perspective of China. Secondly, achieving practical effectiveness must remain the primary guiding principle. The efficacy of both hard laws and soft laws hinges on their ability to resolve real problems. Outer space security governance requires addressing both symptoms and root causes to find sustainable solutions. It is important to both tackle pressing issues and take into account long-term challenges by interpreting, improving, and developing existing international laws. Against the backdrop of the Golden Dome program and the growing risks of an arms race in outer space, how to address the weaponization of outer space should be treated as the pressing and central issue. If the root causes of weaponization of outer space are not addressed and this trend is allowed to develop unchecked, outer space will inevitably become a de facto warfighting domain. At that point, there will be no peace in space, there will be increasing weapons deployed in space, and peaceful utilization and sustainable development will become unattainable. The pursuit of dominance in outer space and planned deployment of space-based missile defense interceptors will only trigger weaponization of outer space. Thirdly, we must adhere to multilateralism as the fundamental governance path. The Conference on Disarmament is the sole multilateral disarmament negotiating body established by the SLC-1. The UN is the core platform for practicing multilateralism and advancing global governance, the role of which must be further enhanced rather than gradually weakened. The consensus report adopted by UNGGE last August clearly demonstrates that negotiation of a legally binding instrument remains the most effective and widely accepted approach by the international community to prevent an arms race in outer space. It also underscores that focusing on the use of force and weapons remain a viable approach. In this regard, the draft PPWT submitted and updated jointly by China and Russia remains the only draft treaty on the table. We welcome continued support and constructive inputs from all parties. We look forward to substantive deliberations by OEWG on perils in all its aspects in the coming years. China will uphold the vision of global governance based on extensive consultation, joint contribution, and shared benefits. We will actively engage in the relevant process and make our due contribution to strengthening effective governance of outer space and ensuring a lasting stability and security in outer space. Just now, Madam Van Dielen mentioned, it seems that it's not quite important to maintain strategic stability in space. For that, I specifically emphasize that there is a need to ensure the lasting stability and peace in space. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for those remarks. I particularly liked your point on the importance of international law as the core basis for space security, and I think that ties in really nicely with the points made by Arti Holomaini, the director of UNUSA, earlier today, where she also highlighted the importance of international space treaties. So thank you very much for that. Moving on, I'm going to give the floor to Clive Hughes for his general remarks.
Thank you, Almudena and UNIDIR, for convening this important discussion. It's a pleasure to join colleagues from across the international community to reflect on the future of space security. Let me say first that the United Kingdom remains deeply committed to the prevention of an arms race in outer space. We see it as a domain in which we all share benefits and have a shared responsibility to ensure it remains a peaceful domain. It's critical to global security, economic prosperity, and scientific progress. Yet the strategic environment in space is undergoing a profound transformation. There are many aspects to this, but I'd just like to mention three at this stage. Firstly, the geopolitical situation is obviously tense, and this spills over into space. Space is no longer just an enabler of defense and security on Earth, but a domain in which states seem to be contemplating the possibility of war. And related to this, a number of states are developing and testing counterspace capabilities capable of disabling, damaging, or destroying satellites. These capabilities are based on the ground and in orbit. Secondly, over the past decade, we've witnessed a dramatic increase in the number of space actor satellites and capabilities, which others have talked about today. There are now over 11,000 active satellites in orbit, more than triple the number from just 5 years ago when the UK initiated the Responsible Space Behaviours Initiative. It's a remarkable increase in the number of satellites. The vast majority are operated by commercial entities, but many serve dual-use functions, supporting both civilian and military operations. This proliferation has brought undeniable benefits, but it has also introduced new vulnerabilities for all of us and new risks and new challenges to deal with them. The third thing I want to mention is that the orbital environment is becoming increasingly cluttered. There are now over 36,000 trackable debris objects, and millions more remain untrackable. Crucially, over 15% of all trackable debris is a direct result of destructive anti-satellite tests. These tests have created long-lived debris that continues to threaten satellites, crewed missions, and the sustainability of outer space. All these things are interlinked, because as the geopolitical tensions grow and the space capabilities proliferate, we see an increased risk of miscalculation and escalation, and an increase in the potential impacts of miscalculation and escalation. So in this context, the UK believes that legally binding and non-legally binding measures must work in tandem. And at this point, I just want to emphasize that non-binding measures have a vital role to play. They can establish shared understandings of commonly acceptable conduct, which may evolve into binding rules over time. They enable incremental progress by allowing states to build consensus and confidence without the immediate need to commit to legally binding obligations. They offer agility and adaptability, as they can be adopted and updated more swiftly than treaties, making them especially useful in fast-moving technological domains such as space. They support consensus building, as their non-binding nature often facilitates broader participation and cooperation, even on sensitive security issues, as we are discussing. The establishment of the OEWG on Paros under UNGA Resolution 79512 is a welcome step. Its inclusive format and extended timeline offer a real opportunity to build convergence. But we must be honest about the challenges. Divergent threat perceptions, strategic mistrust, definitional ambiguities may continue to hinder progress. The UK will continue to advocate for practical, implementable measures, such as restraint in debris generating activities, measures to mitigate the risks from rendezvous and proximity operations, and amongst others. Our experience with the UN Open-Ended Working Group on Reducing Space Threats from 2022-23 through norms, rules, and principles of responsible space behaviors has shown that inclusive evidence-based dialogue can yield convergence, even if ultimately, in that case, the report was blocked. But we have an opportunity to build on the success of this process. So just finally, in closing, let me say that we should ensure that our diplomatic tools remain adaptive. The space domain is evolving rapidly. Our approaches must evolve with it. The UK stands ready to work with all partners to advance Paros in all its aspects and ensure that space remains secure, stable, and sustainable environment for future generations. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Clive. And I do hope that your words about the potential of the OEWG and the opportunities that it offers come true, despite, of course, the challenges that exist. I'm going to give the floor now to Claudio, to my immediate left, for his general remarks.
It is a pleasure and an honor for me to be part of this distinguished panel and share some of our perceptions, Brazilian perceptions regarding the state of multilateral discussions on Paris. I will focus my remarks on the burning issue, which is the future of the current discussion track that we have, which is the open-ended working group on Paris in all its aspects. For that, I will have to trace back a little bit. I will try not to be too long on what took us to this point. I think it's not lost on this audience that the past 5 years have been marked by an intense debate and even confrontation about two competing approaches that have been advocated for bringing discussions on Paris forward, namely an approach based on the objective of legally binding instrument on Paris, an approach based on the idea of gradually developing non-binding norms on responsible space behaviors. It's easy to think that this polarization is new, but in fact, it's a continuing trend that the discussions on Paris have displayed since the outset, and it's demonstrated for those who want to look into a bit of history by the first two UN General Assembly resolutions that were adopted on this issue in 1981. At that occasion, already two competing resolutions were adopted. One that was presented by the Eastern European and Others group was focused on exactly the objective of a legally binding instrument on the prevention of placement of weapons. And the other, presented by the WEOG, Western European and Others group, was proposed the objective of banning anti-satellite weapons. This is just a demonstration of how difficult these discussions have been due to these tendencies to try to frame the discussions on Paris in a partial way that privileges one aspect or group of aspects of space security over others. This polarization, once again, was clear in 2023, when once again the UN General Assembly adopted two competing resolutions. This time, the opposition was between two objectives that were favored by separate groups of states, and both proposed open-ended working groups to carry these discussions forward. Open-ended working groups, each one of them had different mandate, structure, objectives, timeline for its work, and that created the risk of a irreversible duplication of multilateral tracks for treating the issue of Paris. This caused a group of states, group of developing states, who believed that this polarization was unhelpful, unnecessary, and potentially detrimental to the future of multilateral discussions. This group came to be known as the core group, which is a term that is usually applied to states that come together to present draft resolutions at the UN General Assembly. This core group of developing countries, of which Brazil, my country, is one, Egypt, Indonesia, Jordan, Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, and South Africa, tabled a resolution that aimed to prevent this duplication of efforts through the merger of the two open-ended working groups. The core group also attempted to offer a clear mandate that combined these two approaches as one shared perception among these countries, and certainly one that has characterized Brazil's perceptions on this issue, is that there is no inherent opposition between the approach that is based on an LBI, achieving an LBI, and the approach of gradual buildup of norms. One can help the other, and one cannot sideline the other. This proved to be extremely hard, despite the best efforts of the core group. So the solution that was found was to propose a broad open-ended mandate in the shape of this concept of Paris in all its aspects, which was what eventually found its way to the text of the draft decision. This alternative, this solution enjoyed overwhelming support by the membership of the UN. That didn't prove to be the silver bullet that we hoped, and it was apparent, that was evident, that many states still feared the possibility of a broad open-ended mandate leading to sidelining the overall objective of a legally binding instrument on Paris. So the discussions on the agenda and the work program of this open-ended working group became the focus of these debates. They consumed the entire first session of the open-ended working group on Paris, they were extremely difficult negotiations, but the results of these negotiations have laid the groundwork for what we hope will be a comprehensive and non-exclusionary discussion track on Paris. It's based on the combination of these two tracks, each approach will find its place for the duration of the working group. It is not, again, a silver bullet. No one is under the illusion that this two-track approach will solve all problems, but it's our belief that it is at least a paradigm change in terms of how to frame the problem. But ultimately, the success of this initiative will depend much more on developments outside the room than in the specifics of mandates or agendas or timelines. It's important that we realize that these developments in terms of national policies, actions by major spacefaring nations in terms of war fighting in outer space and their investments and the objective in this regard is probably what is going to make or break this process. Going forward, I think that Brazil and the core group, certainly I don't speak for them, will continue to try to play this bridging and mediation role that we have played throughout the process, both by proposing the draft decision and by our participation in these negotiations in the first session of the open-ended working group. But our responsibility is partial. The whole membership needs to actually contribute towards that goal. And I thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Claudio, for that excellent overview of how we came to have this merged OEWG process. I really like your point on how developments outside of the room really influence the results. I think this echoes something that Clive also said about, geopolitics influencing what happens in space. And so in a way, it's great that we were able to have the merger, because the merger is in a way a success story, that we can have that consensus, that agreement, or that view, that complementarity is possible. So I hope that, I don't want to be overly optimistic. I do acknowledge that it's not a silver bullet, but hopefully that frame of thinking can help the success of the process. I'm going to move on to Konstantin for his general remarks. Please, Konstantin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Almudena. And sitting here on the podium with my colleagues, so it seems to me that I'm not at the Space Security Conference by UNIDIR, but in some kind of group of governmental experts or in OEWG. But I'm glad to welcome all the participants in the annual UNIDIR Outer Space Security Conference. So I would like to thank the organizers of the conference for the efforts they have made in order to make it happen. I hope that this intervention will help the conference to achieve the goals and objectives set before it. So this panel is devoted to the analysis of the origin of Paris concept, various approaches to implementation of this goal, including through the establishment of proper international legal regulation. So let's try to understand these issues. With the emergence of outer space topic on the international agenda, the primary efforts of the UN member states were focused on ensuring free and equal access to outer space, as well as equitable participation in its exploration and use for peaceful purposes. This is on what the attention of international community was focused on in the 60s and 70s of the last century, and it is that it is this that determines the nature of the corresponding international legal framework which was formed in that historical period, and which to these days serves as a reliable foundation for conducting activities in outer space. However, its key feature is that international treaties relating to outer space are highly selective in their approach and do not cover such issues as the placement of weapons, the threat or use of force in, from, or against outer space. In particular, they do not prohibit placement and deployment of weapons that do not fall under the category of weapons of mass destruction in space. As the risks of turning outer space into a springboard for aggression and war, along with the catastrophic consequences of such potential development of issues, were recognized, the focus of the international community's attention with regard to space issues by the end of 1970s gradually shifted towards fulfilling the Paris goal. And this fundamental objective was fully articulated and enshrined in the decisions of the first special session of the UNGA on disarmament in 1978. Concurrently, they reflected the necessity of taking further measures and holding appropriate international negotiations in accordance with the spirit of the Outer Space Treaty of 1967 to prevent a potential arms race in outer space. Over the nearly 50 years that have passed since then, the starting point with regard to outer space has not changed. We still rely on the same international legal framework to ensure safety of the space activities, which has proven to be effective in fulfilling its assigned functions and does not require any revision. Simultaneously, the Paris goal remains of priority, which consists in countering the emergence of military space threats to international peace and global security, as well as preserving outer space for peaceful uses, free from weapons of any kind. Meanwhile, the demand of progress in this area has significantly increased over the years due to the rapid development of science and technology, as well as because of the changing role of outer space in the context of states achieving their strategic goals. Indeed, a number of countries are now actively implementing doctrinal documents that provide for the placement of weapons in outer space and the use of space for conducting combat operations to ensure their dominance and superiority. Concrete programs are carried out to develop and place the relevant means into orbit. And the goal of strengthening the existing international legal framework by developing a relevant international legally binding instrument to ensure the aim of peaceful use of outer space and security of outer space activities set in 1978 remains relevant. The international community continues to recognize the importance of concluding such an LBI, which is evidenced by the number of resolutions on space issue adopted by the UN General Assembly, containing an appropriate appeal, being reflected back in General Assembly resolutions 36/99 and 36/97C, is still appears in resolutions Paris, sponsored by Egypt and Sri Lanka, and further practical measures on Paris, sponsored by Russia, adopted on a regular basis. When the goal is clear, it is necessary to determine the ways to implement it. And the Conference on Disarmament as a single multilateral negotiating forum on disarmament issues is mandated to develop a relevant international treaty. In order to start such work, in 2008, the Russian Federation and China submitted for consideration by the CD a draft treaty on the prevention of the placement of weapons in outer space and the threat or use of force against outer space objects, PPWT. And in 2014, its updated version, taking into account comments and proposals made by some states. The document is still on the negotiating table and can serve as a basis for further work on the LBI. In the period before the launch of negotiations at the CD, the relevant UN open-ended working group established by the UNGA Decision 79/512 is the optimal platform for preparing substantive elements of the future LBI on Paris. The program of work adopted in July generally allows to focus the work of the OEWG as one of areas of its activity, specifically on concrete consideration of the substantive elements of LBI on Paris, taking into account the draft PPWT as well as the consensus report of the group of governmental experts on Paris adopted in 2024, which is intended to ensure the continuity of the discussion. It is necessary to ensure constructive, non-politicized work in the OEWG in order to achieve meaningful results and contribute to achieving the Paris goal. Recently, there have been calls to focus priority attention in the framework of discussions of Paris issues on the development and implementation of non-binding measures in relation to space activities. In this context, it is necessary to clearly understand that such measures are important means of strengthening trust between states for the period before the adoption of a relevant LBI, but due to their non-binding nature, they are not able to prevent an arms race in outer space and the deployment of weapons in outer space. They only partially contribute to increasing confidence in the peaceful intentions of states, help raise awareness, and create conditions for the formation of a predictable strategic, economic, and security situation. Thus, non-binding measures can only complement but not substitute the relevant international LBI. In line with the provisions of the UNGA resolution on Paris, they should be aimed to become an integral part of such an instrument. A striking example of non-binding measures for Paris goal is the international initiative political commitment of no first placement of weapons in outer space, but taking into account its non-binding nature and taking into account that not all the spacefaring nations joined this initiative, it is alone cannot achieve the Paris goal or ensure the fulfillment of this goal. Apparently, the global community as a whole has identified a way to achieve the Paris goal. Now it remains to put this approach into practice. This can also be facilitated by relevant efforts at the city and in the framework of the OEWG. We hope that the work of these forums will be completed by agreeing on substantive conclusions and recommendations. Relevant resolutions of the General Assembly should also contribute positively, including the traditional Russian resolutions, further practical measures on Paris, no first placement of weapons in outer space, and transparency and confidence building measures in outer space activities. So Russia plans to submit the new drafts for consideration by the first committee of the 80th session of the UN General Assembly this year. When preparing the mentioned documents, the accumulated developments in the field of space security, as well as the results of the work of various specialized multilateral formats are taken into account. So we would like to use this opportunity to call on all states to support and co-sponsor Russian draft resolutions. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Konstantin. I really liked your point about how non-legally binding measures can complement legally binding measures. I think you're absolutely right when you pointed out that having a legally binding measure for space security is a big priority for a lot of states. So it was wonderful to see that consensus report that we achieved in the GG for further practical measures on Paros. If you'll allow me to paraphrase what you talked about, I think we can understand all of these different initiatives for Paris as different building blocks to achieve, that ultimate goal of the prevention of an arms race in outer space. And even initiatives such as the PPWT, which Constantine, you reference, Ambassador Shen, you also reference, even though it's not an actual treaty, it can serve as a basis for the building of new initiatives for Paris. So I thought that was an interesting point to make about it potentially being a basis for a future LBI. I'm going to move on to our last speaker of today's panel for her general remarks. That is Emily, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much to Unity also for organizing this conference and for organizing this panel and for inviting me to talk in it. So it's really a pleasure to reflect on this topic on Paros in all its aspects in the aftermath of the last session, the July session of the OEWG Paros in all its aspects. And I would like to take this time to reflect on the past year of the OEWG, kind of building on my colleague's previous statement and draw some perspective for the years to come in the OEWG. First, France remains committed to achieve the overall objective of Paros in all its aspects. And first, let me acknowledge also the progress that we have made during the year, even though was hard to achieve so, but we made quite a few progress, and I want to underline them. So first, this year, the first year of the OEWG was kind of unprecedented. We have successfully merged two processes and kickstart the discussion in the new OEWG in order to carry on the discussion on Paros in a more effective and inclusive way. And I want here to thank leadership of the core group, as you mentioned in Claudio, especially Brazil and Egypt and all the other countries that you have mentioned. So it was a collective success, but then we need to, as we say in rugby, to convert the try and make it happen in reality to make some progress. And then after two inconclusive sessions in 2025, we finally agreed collectively to adopt an agenda and a work program to finally kickstart the discussion on Paros. Albeit the work program was in two tracks and it was not kind of concretely merging the two processes, but it was a real start. So although it is early days to draw conclusion on the merger, the last formal session showed that the merger came through clearly in the statement of the member states, as well as their willingness to put forward solution to Paros. We have witnessed that there was a trans-regional majority of delegation emphasized the diversity and complementarity of both normative and legally binding measures to prevent an arms race in outer space in all its aspects. So I don't want here to be naive and say that in 3 years we're going to make incredible progress on Paros in all its aspects, considering the struggle in the last groups and also considering the strategic context and the geopolitical context we're in. But let me draw here some guidelines, I would say, to try to make progress and to work in a positive way to start and achieve and have some outcome for this OEWG. So first, the first guideline I would say we try to work towards is that building on past discussion and progress already made in the past group. We tend to have create different working group and forget about the past work, even though we had some conceptual reports. We can have the OEWG in 2021 where we had really constructive discussion, even though we didn't have a report that was blocked. We need to take into account all this discussion because there was many ideas and perspective that was shared. And it's important that we kind of find this perspective and those ideas within the new OEWG. So several works can nourish our discussion, and it came from further implementing the recommendation from the 2013 TCBN reports, and also drawing from national experiences, expertise and proposal that emerged from the past OEWG and GG, UN resolution, also experiences from all the fields. So we had a lot of resources at our disposal, and it's we need to take that into account to nourish our discussion within this new OEWG. The second guidelines I wanted to draw was working at reaching as much as possible a common understanding of space threats. Because without a basic common assessment, it is unlikely that we collectively find consensual instruments of principle to contribute to Paris and on its aspects. Today, we miss basic in our interaction between space actors. We miss communication, transparency. We lack those currently, and we can't make simple and basic progress on that. And finally, the last guideline I wanted to draw was embracing the diversity and complementarity of normative and legal measures in instrument to achieve Paris in all its aspects. Because it's only the combination of several measures and instruments, such as TCBN and standards of responsible norms of principle and rules of responsible behavior, that will and is already strengthening space security and contributing effectively and with credibility to our collective security. And so one can say, what do we need that kind of diversity and complementarity? It's because we're facing the development of wide variety of threats emanating from different vectors. We're facing the multiplication of unfriendly, ambiguous, and even provocative events. So the concept of powers must be widened to include the risk of uncontrolled escalation. And this needs to be adjusted by measures and a complementarity of measures and instruments to face that. So changes in the outer space environment are happening really rapidly, but we have 3-4 years within that OEWG to reach concrete results. This OEWG is a chance to put on the table all past and present initiatives taken, see what worked and what have not worked, what could be improved, in order to strengthen the international legal framework applicable to outer space, and launch new, effective, and immediate measures to make progress on Paris and on its aspects. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emily. I think those were really useful guidelines. I particularly liked your last point on the importance of diversity and complementarity. I think this word complementarity is something that every single person in the panel has mentioned in one way or another. I think it's important to acknowledge that legally binding measures and non-legally binding measures are different. They fulfilled different roles and they have different effects, but it's true that they can be very much complementary. So we're going to move on to the moderated Q&A section of the panel. I do remind attendees that if you have questions, please start thinking about them. I'm going to use my moderator prerogative to ask all of you a question. But yes, put your nameplates up if you're in the room. And if you are joining us virtually, please do use the Q&A function. So going back to the whole complementarity issue that I just mentioned, because we talk a lot about it, but I would love to hear a more concrete reference or a more concrete explanation from all of the panelists of how do you think that these non-legally binding and legally binding measures can complement each other, and also acknowledging that we cannot be overly optimistic, there is no silver bullets, etc. What are the challenges that you see from these efforts such as the OEWG to bring together these different approaches? I think maybe we could go in the reverse order that we started from. So I'm going to give the floor to you again, Emily, if that's all right.
Starting on this idea of maybe a more concrete explanation of how this could be complementary. So as we could have said previously, and other colleagues have said, usually and historically we have seen that non-binding measures have kind of paved the way for legally binding instrument, but this is quite kind of really vague. But we have seen it, for example, for the non-placement and of weapons of mass destruction in outer space, which was previously a non-legally binding UN resolution that paved the way and was then found in the Article 4 of the Outer Space Treaty. So this is kind of the concrete example, and was the dynamic that many states wanted to implement with the proposals led by the UK on norms, rules, and principles of responsible behaviors, meaning that if one state in the United States were making commitments, voluntary commitments, which is kind of the same, making voluntary, binding them by a treaty, but making voluntary commitments to responsible behavior and not endangering other states' assets, for example. That would be a first start just to create increased trust and allow states to better cooperate in outer space. Of course, what we see is that there is rapid technological change and an increase in tension that are experienced in outer space. So in this concept, we need to have a diversity of measures. We can't have just, we need that one compass that the OST and other treaty applicable to outer space are, but we need concrete measures to address the situation that is quite evolving. So we need flexible instruments, which is key. And first and foremost, maybe just two objectives, if I may, to maybe have a more concrete example. First and foremost, what is at stake is that we need greater transparency and predictability in space activities, which is simple and concrete result is a recommendation from the TCBM report in 2013. 13. And for example, France is committed in its national space strategy, is clearly stating what action we are going to take in outer space. And we are really clear about that. We can also quote the space security portal of UNIDIR, which is also a TCBM, and we always welcome all states to contribute to it, which is contribute to transparency. And next to that, and as a complementary measure, what we need also and what is required is in-depth work on characterizing behaviors that could constitute threats in outer space. And many solutions and many ideas, constructive discussion were held in the last OEDBG on norms, rules, and principles of responsible behavior that we could get an inspiration of. And this combination of different instruments and measures that are concrete and it can be taken now. We don't need many mechanisms. We just need the goodwill of states to do so. That could be a concrete result.
Thank you very much for that. I really liked how you mentioned diversity of measures, but with the outer space treaty at the center, if I understood correctly. And I would also add maybe the other space treaties as well, because you talked about predictability. And this morning we had Arsi Holomaini from UNISA talking about the importance of the registration convention, which can also help with that predictability point that you made. I'm going to give the floor to Constantine now for his remarks on this issue.
Thank you very much, Almudena. First of all, with regard to non-legally binding measures, so we should understand that the purposes of legally binding measures and non-legally binding measures could differ in nature, because taking into account that these measures are totally different by their legal nature. So as I said in my first statement, the non-legally binding measures could increase confidence in the peaceful intentions by different outer space actors. So it could help raise awareness, could create the conditions for predictable and normal outer space activities. And if we look at the previous practice of non-legally binding measures, so it is mostly about ensuring security of outer space activities. And we have the principles for long-term sustainability. So from our point of view, it is a good example of non-legally binding measures and how these non-legally binding measures could contribute to the Paris goal. But if we are talking about the issues like the issues of hard security, it is absolutely impossible to ensure the fulfillment of Paris goal in this sphere by non-legally binding measures only. And the good example here, different initiatives in this sphere, so including the Russian initiative of on no first placement of weapons in outer space. So this initiative is aimed at maintaining international peace, ensuring equal and indivisible security for all, as well as improving the predictability and sustainability of states' activities in the peaceful exploration and the use of outer space. So it is intended to contribute to the elaboration and conclusion of a relevant LBI, as well as to eventually become its integral part in the form of a specific ban on the placement of weapons of any kind in outer space. But at the same time, this initiative only at this stage could not ensure the ban on placement of weapons in outer space and resolving of this really critical problem for fulfilling Paris goal. It's just one example, but it's not the only example. It is absolutely all the same situation with regard to ASAT initiative and some other initiatives, including transparency and confidence building measures related to these hard security issues and to different issues with regard to strategic stability as well. Also about, and I share what you, Almudena, said, that definitely non-legally binding measures and legally binding measures, they are for different goals, and that's why in the GGE TCBM report, it is clearly stated that these TCBMs could just complement but not substitute a legally binding instrument. What about the concept of responsible behavior in outer space that my colleagues mentioned several times in the framework of our discussion? So I'd like also to say a few words about that. So this concept promoted by Western countries is in its turn redundant and largely artificial, taking into account the mentioned situation in the context of efforts to achieve Paris. So I could explain why. In accordance with, for example, the paragraph 12 of the preambular part of the UNGA Resolution 7922, reducing space threats through norms, rules, and principles of responsible behaviors, this concept provides for achieving the Paris goal through a combination of a legally binding instrument and non-binding measures. And in fact, the existing scheme described by me in my statement, where I told about legally binding instrument as a goal and also non-legally binding measures as some kind of complementary measures, is reproduced by this concept, which involves parallel work on legal obligations and political commitments in the field of space security, with the understanding that the latter will complement but not replace the former. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Konstantin. I thought it was really interesting that you mentioned how non-LBIs can eventually lead to LBIs, but you also touched on how non-LBIs, such as the LTS guidelines, can help further develop principles that exist in legally binding agreements like the Outer Space Treaty, like, for example, the LTS guidelines, I think, lend some clarity to concepts such as due regard, for example, which is, that LBI to non-LBI is something that we talk about less than the non-LBI towards LBI. So I thought that was an interesting thing to point to as well. I'm going to hand the floor to Claudio now for your thoughts.
My ideas to a great extent were already expressed by Emily and Konstantin. I think that it is great to see that this contrast between these two approaches is gradually eroding. There was a point in the 2022-2023 open-ended working group on space threats in which there seemed to be in the minds of some a irredeemable opposition between these two notions, and this has been long our position that this polarization between these two approaches is not grounded on reality. Emily mentioned, I think, the most glaring and obvious example of this, and more relevant for work, which is the Outer Space Treaty, which sprang up from a UN General Assembly resolution. And I think that the non-binding approach is also reflected in the and the value of the non-binding approach has also been reflected in the initiatives mentioned by Konstantin, in particular the non-first placement of weapons in outer space, and also the resolution on a moratorium on direct ascent anti-satellite weapon tests, both of which are very much supported by my country. It is also reflected on the fact that we don't see a break or a separation between the measures advocated by in those two fields in the report, the draft report of the OEWG on space threats, on the GG on Paris report, and also on the proposals that we have been seeing thus far on the OEWG on Paris. Both measures are consistently advocated. We do believe that some aspects of space security cannot be addressed than by a legally binding instrument. Like Konstantin has mentioned, some aspects deal with hard security matters that it is very hard to see how those can be addressed through merely non-binding codes of conduct or General Assembly resolutions. It's unavoidable that comprehensive solutions to the problems of space security will have to build upon the existing legal framework, which is almost universally recognized as insufficient to address these issues, especially as strategic competition in space and using space becomes ever more powerful, and as the relevance of space grows for the international community as a whole. And it's important to mention here that I think it's obvious to many of the participants in the debate, but it's always important to remember that this is not an issue for major spacefaring nations alone. It has been discussed many occasions in this morning that how crucial space is for all countries, and in particular developing countries and those that depend on space-based services, and that includes pretty much every single member state of the UN. So that's my 2 cents on the issue. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I couldn't agree more with that last point, that all states are stakeholders when it comes to space. And I also really like your point about how these different approaches, that they are not incompatible, they are not mutually exclusive, that false dichotomy. I'm also very happy to see that it's being eroded. And I think, even though LBIs and non-LBIs have different roles, they are at the strongest when they are utilized together in cooperation with one another. And I think the responsible behaviors approach maybe highlights this in a way, because just because something is within the bounds of legality doesn't necessarily mean that it is what is best for space security or for space sustainability. So my read of the responsible behaviors approach is that it sets a high threshold of what we can do to improve space security. But of course, I'm going to give the floor to Clive now, and please do correct me if I'm wrong when it comes to my read of that.
I think I understand you want to understand more concretely how legally binding and non-legally binding instruments kind of complement each other. And you're right, it's easy to say this, and comments on this often sort of descend into vague kind of statements on the complementarity of it. But yeah, can we demonstrate it and make it reality? I mean, maybe there are 3 ways in which complementarity could be achieved. One I've already mentioned in my remarks is that a non-legally binding instrument can evolve into a legally binding instrument, and we saw that with the Outer Space Treaty, and there may be other examples out there. I'm sure there are, and there could be in future. So that's one way in which the complementarity is there. I guess a second way in which the complementarity could be achieved is that by agreeing non-binding instruments that perhaps set expectations around state conduct, it provides some kind of interpretive tool for the existing legal framework, or some kind of indication of what states think is right. Because we often say, like, And the legal instruments may be durable, not offer clarity, but they don't always offer clarity. Article 9 is quite broad and open to interpretation. So, so we could serve, NBIs could serve to clarify this kind of thing over time if states had the willingness to do that. And then I think the third way in which they're sort of complementary is that a legally binding instrument could just stand alone by itself over the long term and be useful, because if a broad range of states committed to a non-binding measure and abided by it, then that's really useful, right? So nothing wrong with that, and that just contributes to the overall legal and normative framework. So that's three ways in which this complementarity could be achieved. And I agree with some of what Constantine said in terms of like NBI serving as a tool to build confidence, raise awareness, improve predictability. And I think there is some kind of common understanding amongst us all about the role of NBIs, but although obviously there are differences as well. And I just want to pick him up on one thing about responsible space behaviours being kind of supported by kind of Western nations. I think there is broader support than that. I think as is demonstrated by the number of votes we have for the responsible space behaviours resolution. I think the Russian Federation and the United States are kind of have a common challenge here, in the sense that Russia has promoted the No First Placement initiative, has a lot of votes, but a limited number of sign-ups. Same with the direct dissent resolution, a lot of votes, but a limited number of sign-ups to the actual measure. And so the challenge is to build that superficial support in the vote into a deeper support around the commitment. And but there's a shared challenge there, right? So.
Thank you for that, Clive. And I liked both of your examples of how non-LBI can go into an LBI, and how also an LBI can be further informed by the development of non-LBIs. And on your point of standalone non-legally binding agreements, I think both the examples that you mentioned, the direct dissent ASAT commitment, which currently has, I believe, 38 states that have issued their commitment, and then there is, of course, the No First Placement commitment, which I think currently has 33 states that have issued their commitment. I would actually direct you to the Secure World Foundation, which has a repository of where they track, how many states have signed on to this. And I believe these are the accurate numbers, but if I'm wrong, I'm sure the people from Secure World Foundation will correct me. I am going to hand it over to Ambassador Shen for your thoughts on this issue.
Thank you, Dina. And it's easy for me to answer the questions after Constantine and Claudia mentioned already. I fully share the views they have expressed regarding the complementarity between legally binding and non-legally binding measures. And I also refer to it in my general statement. As far as we're concerned, that non-legally binding measures can be complementary to legally binding measures, but at the same time, they should not be a substitute for legally binding instrument. And during the discussions last year, when we are trying to merge the two processes, I think one of the fundamental differences between parties is what's the relationship between legally binding and non-legally binding, whether there is possibility for legally binding instrument to be negotiated in the future. As far as we are concerned, we never exclude the possibility of negotiating non-legally binding measures. But at the same time, we believe we need to have the consensus agreement that in the future, there will be legally binding instrument to be negotiated, and all these non-legally binding instruments or measures can complement to that. One specific question or some specific recommendations already being proposed in the GG report that had been adopted last year, and many of the authors are here, raising some possible elements, including focusing on the definition, focusing on possible verification. All these elements can be built upon to have more detailed elements, either non-legally binding measures or legally binding measures. And there are various international instruments, legally binding instruments that can include some voluntary measures that can be considered at TCBMs. So right now we have this OEWG, which provided a good platform for us to elaborate some of the elements. I think we can make best use of the GG report, as well as what has already been discussed in the previous OEWGs, though we didn't have consensus reports, but some of the elements can be built upon. And specifically, I think it is very important to have further discussions about the definition of weapons and also the definition of the use of force. That will have a clear picture of what kind of measures we can take. That does not necessarily mean that we are talking about the definition of weapons or definition of the use of force, means that we are negotiating the legally binding instrument. I think whether it's legally binding or non-legally binding, there is a utility for us to have better understanding of what do we mean about weapons, especially when we have this dual use characteristics. And also it is necessary for us to understand, have a common understanding, what do we mean by the use of force. And all these discussions can take place in the platform of OEWG. And of course, we need not forget that we have Conference on Disarmament here in Geneva. So we do hope these platforms can provide good opportunities for us to elaborate further on possible measures that can contribute in the future legally binding instrument or TCBMs. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. I'm extremely glad that you mentioned 2 points, which first of all is the fact that we have to rely on what has been discussed in the past. I think this is such an important aspect of the Paros dialogue. We cannot think of each new process as a blank slate. We don't have to reinvent the wheel, but we have to rely on the efforts and the initiatives, whether they've been fully adopted, fully successful or not. Those conversations are always useful and we can rely on them. So I think that's really important. And your point on the importance of definitions, I think that is absolutely key. The way that we use language, the way that we interpret language is so important. To your point on the use of force, I would be remiss if I didn't mention a Unity report that we published last year on this issue by Erin Popji and myself. And also, I'd be remiss if I didn't point to the outer space security lexicon. So if you're not familiar with this tool, I highly encourage you to check it out. But we hope that these initiatives by Unity will also help move discussions on Paros along for states. Now I'm going to move on to Marilyn, who is online for her thoughts on this issue.
Thank you very much, Almudena. I moved a bit closer. I have a choice of seats around this table, so I hope you can see me better now and also hear me better now, because I apologize if you could not hear my remarks clearly on strategic stability. Of course, I will never say that strategic stability is not important. My remarks were to make clear that if we only look from a strategic competition lens and look at from a lens of the arms control agreements of the previous century, then we miss something. And we don't want to miss important points for our security. So just to clarify that, maybe that wasn't clear. But on your questions, a lot has already been said, and I agree with a lot of it. I would like to highlight just that if we talk about complementarity, and I'm happy to hear that the whole panel supports complementarity, it also means we need to discuss the 2 approaches equally. And that's what I tried to set out in my initial remarks. We need this holistic approach where we look at how we look together at how these approaches can join forces. And if this is a true multilateral approach, it requires an open mind from all sides, and it requires a lot of listening to each other's issues, but also to each other's threat perceptions, for example. So as Emily said, that is also a really good starting point for discussion. As EU, we had a working paper on this for the previous session of the open-ended working group. But we would be very open to having more in-depth discussions. And then, of course, it's key to start discussing concrete elements, and quite a number were mentioned, and I would only like to support that. Because I think we have spent a lot of time, all of us, either promoting one approach or another, or one initiative or another. But now we need to move beyond that and actually start the substantive debate on those in order to move forward. I would also like to support what's been said about the importance of the work of UNIDIR. The lexicon and all the tools you have on the website, this conference, I think they are really helpful in supporting delegations, in improving their understanding, and they facilitate the debate, I think, among ourselves. So thank you for all that. We will try to make good use of that. And they also allow for all participants to participate equally, to have the same level of knowledge, be they from spacefaring nations or not. And one final point, I wanted also to thank the core group for working on that merger decision. It was some heavy lifting that was required when we had the discussions in first committee, and there was compromise on both sides. And this spirit of compromise is something that we need to carry forward, and that's what I meant by this openness to other positions, in order to be able to get to this complementarity. So, thank you for the opportunity to.
Thank you very much, Marilyn. I really like your point about the importance of considering the perceptions of others. It's true that each state might have their own perspectives, their own preferences or priorities, but understanding, even if you don't agree, understanding where the representative sitting in front of you in the negotiating table comes from is also really important to ensure that negotiations can be fruitful. So I thought that was a very interesting point. We have only a few minutes until the close of the panel, but I do want to open the floor to questions. We're going to take maybe a couple of questions, and you can let us know if your question is addressed to a particular panelist. I will leave the panelists the chance to choose what they want to answer, and while you also, I'll give each of you the floor so you can address the question specifically, and also I would ask you to provide like a final highlights that you want to end the session with. So I do see Adeboye over there. And then I think, Goyu, you've had your placard for a long time. And then I don't know if it's Regina or if it's Jessica. Is it Jessica? Okay, so maybe we'll take those three. I'm sorry that I cannot take all of your questions. So I think Adeboye, you were the first one. So please go ahead.
Thank you very much. My name is Adeboye. I'm one of the youth video winners. And my question is directed to Mr. Clive Hughes. I was opportune to read your 2023 Geneva statement, and you mentioned and you highlighted that the risk of accidents has increased due to the unpredictability in maneuvers and absence of transparency and communication. That was in 2023. And today you also mentioned that there is a dramatic increase in the satellites in orbit over the years. And having that dramatic increase has intensified that risk of collisions. So I'm just curious to know what measures have been taken and will be taken to improve transparency and communication between space actors in order to reduce this risk of collision and space maneuver issues.
It was again Goyu from BIT. I thank the statements from all the diplomats today. But first, I have to say I'm not convinced that to argue hard law is complementary to soft law. It's not accepted by a lawyer. Hard law treaties is the fundamental measure for the rule of law in outer space. But when argue soft law is complementary to hard law, just allow me humbly challenge the so-called voluntary basis of the responsible behavior approach. To me, the only non-legally binding measure is TCBM. As to some other rules proposed by many delegations who support the responsible behavior approach, if you look at the rules specifically closely, all of them has a very strong, clear legal basis. Just as Clive mentioned, Article 9 or the Charter, Article 2, Paragraph 4. So for me, clearly, such kind of rules, specific rules, are the elaboration or interpretation of the legally binding obligation. So my question just to the initiator, of course, and supporter of this approach, allow me, Clive, Emily, Marlene. So first, whether it is contradictory between a state's obligation to implement legal obligation and the self-announced so-called voluntary basis for such kind of rules, whether it's contradictory to each other. So if so, whether I can argue that the approach of responsible behavior actually is approach of interpretation of treaty according to treaty law, then whether you think it's just directly contribute to draft a legally binding instrument in the future. Thank you.
You've put so much substance on the table when it comes to the program of work. So we've been talking a lot about complementarity, and it's really been focused on function, you know, what functions can different approaches provide. But I'm more curious about where the content of the program of work might take you. So when you look at this dual track approach, you're really duplicating a lot of conversations in some place, looking at, say, protection of civilians from a legal perspective and protection of civilians from a norms of responsible behavior perspective. And I'm wondering, you know, which topics on this very heavy agenda do you think will benefit most from talking about them from those two perspectives? Where do you think the most traction or the most value will come from having this dual approach or complementary approach?
Thank you so much for those questions. So to recap what those questions are, first from Adeboye, it was directed to Clive about measures to increase transparency to avoid collision of satellites. Then from Guoyu, directed to Marilyn, Clive, and Emily about the responsible behaviors approach and how that can contribute to the formation of an LBI. And lastly, Jessica, and standards for everybody on the panel to discuss what topics will benefit the most from the dual approach that this OBWG has. So I think I'm going to go, since there are questions for everybody, I think I'm going to go in the order that we started so that each speaker may choose what to say. And also I would ask you to wrap up with a highlight, you know, 2-word that you like to leave the panel and the session with. Marilyn, let's start with you, if that's okay.
All right, sure, yeah, and I will be brief because I think much has already been said. What for us is key that we now start talking substance. We've had this debate about different approaches. There's different opinions there. We agree on complementarity. Now let's get to work. So I don't want to dwell again on the legal elements of one approach or the other. I think we need to collectively move past that. And that brings me to Jessica's question on what topics can best be discussed. As I said, I think a starting point for these discussions is to discuss threat perceptions. But transparency, I think, is a very good second one, as it is TCBMs is mentioned by both approaches. So I'd like to now put my votes to those two issues or topics. But then, as I just said, the importance of multilateralism is to also discuss what's important to others. I'm really open to listening to what others will put on the table.
Thank you very much, Marilyn, and thank you so much for joining us virtually. It's such a shame that we can have you here, but it was lovely to have you online. Ambassador Shen, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dina. And it's really very dangerous to speak in front of the lawyer. I didn't know, I didn't mention that I think I mentioned the soft law complementary to hard law. Of course, Guo, you can disagree with me. Talking about the topics, I think every topic is very important. I think we spent 2 sessions, including organizational sessions, to come to agreement on the program and also on the topics. So it's a kind of compromise made from different parties. So it's safe to say that every topic on the table is very important. Of course, as far as China is concerned, I refer to several issues like the definition, like the verification, and also the PPWT. Definitely that will be the key topics we would prefer to say. And I agree with Marilyn that there are other issues that others attach very important too. We do hope that through substantive discussions on all the elements on the different topics, we can come up with a general understanding the way forward in 2028. And to conclude, from today's discussion, I generally feel that there is genuine wish from all parties that we need to fill the gap in the governance of space security, of course, through different approaches. And in this regard, I think recently we put forward an initiative, the Global Governance Initiative, as put forward by our president, in which he specifically highlighted the importance of multilateralism, and he specifically highlighted the importance of international law and the importance of equality. I think these elements are very important to guide us to a successful discussion in the OEWG and in other forums in the multilateral format to promote space security and also safety in other areas. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. So now I'm going to give the floor to Clive for your thoughts.
I guess maybe I should focus on Adebayo's question, as it was addressed directly to me. I mean, I agree with much of what Marilyn said, so forgive me, Guy, if I just focus on that question. So, I mean, yeah, it's a good question. I think there's work that both Vienna and Geneva can do on this, I think, from different perspectives. Obviously, for the OEWG on Paros in all its aspects, I hope that we do have a good discussion around this kind of non-consensual rendezvous and proximity operations questions, because presumably, you know, these activities are happening, possibly becoming more frequent. The technologies that enable them becoming more sort of sophisticated and allowing ever more possibility. So presumably there are kind of scope for misunderstanding or accidents and so on. So that's worth kind of discussing, you know, what potential norms we could develop around that. But of course, Vienna is going to have to look at it from a different perspective in terms of the sort of guidelines that need to be developed for sort of the consensual, if you like, rendezvous and proximity operations, maybe for debris removal or kind of in-orbit manufacturing and so on. So I think these are both very difficult topics. Both have security dimensions, both have sustainability dimensions, but each forum has to kind of find a way to address the issue within its own mandate, I think. But it's very difficult, and I don't know how quick we're going to get to any kind of outcomes on that, but at least it's on the agenda for the OEWG, and so discussions should, in theory, be happening on it.
During the negotiations of the agenda and program of work, we heard complaints about what this 2-track approach would mean. That would detract from, for example, from the spirit of the decision 79512 of a comprehensive approach to Paris. We believe that these concerns are not invalid, but they depend mostly on the willingness of states to engage on both tracks and to actually present constructive proposals and, as has been said previously, to listen to the concerns of others. I think that the fact that we have a consensus agenda and a consensus program of work is a strong indication that we're on the right track, to use the word again. But I think that it should be seen actually as a blessing in disguise. At least that's how I chose to look at it, in the sense that it proved to be the way to allay fears that discussing non-binding norms would be a way to brush aside the objective of an LBI, which I think has been on the minds of many states, and I have to confess, including my own, since these discussions about non-binding norms on space behaviors have started. And I think that this is the first blessing in disguise or silver lining of this concession to multilateral convoluted language. The other one is to create an incentive structure. If these two tracks are reflected in an equal footing, and these preconditions that I alluded to before are met, there will be incentives for compromise at the end of the day when the draft report and its substantive recommendations will be negotiated. Such incentive structure would be absent if these OEWGs were working in separate ways and with different timelines and no actual issue linkage between these dimensions. So I think that this is the first element. And as I alluded to before, I think that we shouldn't focus too much necessarily on these details, the nitty-gritty. I think that thankfully we dealt with now. I think that it will be contingent upon the actual position of member states, and in particular those that have greater responsibilities in this field. And we hope to see this engagement going forward. Thank you.
First of all, about NFP, so it is 37 member states already joined the initiative. So it's almost 40 and something similar to a set initiative, I think. So about the question on the added value of non-legally binding instruments or measures, I agree it is a really important question. And I'd like to say that another limit that non-legally binding measures have, it is the necessity to take into account the geopolitical environment, taking into account that we are talking about the measures that should improve confidence among states, and in some circumstances these measures could not work, taking into account that there could be a real deficit of trust among states. And I'd like to underline that it is really necessary for the non-binding measures to have quite a positive geopolitical environment in order to have these measures workable and feasible. So, and that's why in really difficult geopolitical circumstances where we have some deficit of trust among states, it would be better to have really strong obligations under international law in order to be sure that the space could be safe and could be considered as the environment without any conflicts. So that's why even to start any kind of dialogue related to some issues on outer space security, it is necessary to have the positive conditions for that. Without positive conditions, it would be quite difficult to have especially non-binding measures workable, taking into account this deficit of trust. What about two-track approach? So we consider this approach not as like a beauty contest among two approaches, even if we have all the same topics under the consideration on both tracks. So we consider that in the framework of quite general topic that would be considered by the OEWG, some aspects could be considered as aspects that are more relevant for non-legally binding measures that could be regulated by some kind of guiding principles or these kind of measures, or maybe TCBMs if it would be the case. But if we are talking about LBIs, so some aspects could be regulated by a legally binding instrument. So that's why we do consider this two-track approach in this way. Of course, we could not avoid 100% that it could be the discussion and the analysis whether this approach is more relevant or that approach is more relevant. It could be possible, but we are not in a position to have this kind of discussion in the framework of the OEWG. What we expect the discussion about substantial elements of an LBI, and we have the basis, as some colleagues referenced to, it is the GG report from the last year, where all the elements were mentioned by the experts, and so it's up to us to consider that. And what about non-legally binding measures to consider different possible aspects related to outer space security, and mostly from our point of view, to the security of outer space activities that could be in line with the discussion in Vienna, in Copius, and we should be also cautious about that. Also to consider in the OEWG these aspects as possible aspects that could be regulated by some kind of non-binding measures. And also I'd like to say what is really important for the OEWG, it is that it is the open-minded approach by all the states parties of this OEWG. So not to have any limits in their national positions for some kind of discussion or consideration of these issues or that issues. So not to have something that could be unacceptable from the beginning in the framework of this discussion. So at minimum, we have all the opportunities to consider different issues, including the development of a legally binding instrument on Paris, including inter alia on the prevention of the placement of weapons in outer space. And we understand that some colleagues mentioned different aspects that should be considered, but from our point of view, we need to see it all together and to discuss how these problems could be resolved. I think it is quite the approach that is really needed in the OEWG in order to have the substantive results in the end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and also thank you for pointing out that it's 37 states that have issued the no first placement commitments. That's good to know. And last but certainly not least, Emily, the floor is yours for your closing points.
First on TCBM and their impact and how they can serve it. So I'm not going to repeat what Clive I've explained in its previous remark, which was quite clear, but TCBM is not just about explaining one treaty or one legally binding condition. It can be very much more than that. We have TCBMs and norms of responsible behavior that can be norms in themselves. And Konstantin was just talking about the condition, the need of having positive condition to develop and non-binding measures. But I would say that we need also positive condition to start a negotiation of a legally binding instruments. Considering the current strategic context, it's really unlikely that we will make really rapidly progress in the negotiation of legally binding instruments. So we can basically say the same thing. We need the positive condition, and the current strategic context does not allow us for this positive development. So basically non-binding measures, by considering their nature, they are more flexible, and we already seen some progress, and we've been able to unite some countries' support to promote some non-binding measures. So we know that even if the strategic context is difficult, we can have some progress there. So that's why we wanted to insist on the fact that norms in themselves can be can show and express the willingness of states to have better behaviors in outer space and to then enhance space security. Maybe to answer also Jessica's question about the different topics and how we can more express or exemplify the complementarity between the norms and the binding measures. So basically we have many topics, and the idea and what we think in our view is that we need to have the chance to take back all the past discussion, because those amount of topics is a result also of our past discussions since 2013. So we're not sure if we are going to have time to address everything, but we will try and just following along with the discussion. But what I wanted also to highlight in under that point is that we called many times for this OEWG to be an inclusive process, to make sure that we have civil society or the space sector to share their knowledge, that could really contribute to that discussion. And also inclusivity means having all states, space-faring nation, and all states basically because in the room we all depends on space, whether we have major capacity or whether we are not. So inclusivity means all the space sector contributing to the discussion and developing ideas, facilitate consensus and bring their expertise to discussion, to ground our discussion in reality, and also to have a chance to make sure that all participating member states have a chance to express the perception, can add to the discussion, and then we can facilitate the discussion. So I hope you answer kind of question.
Thank you very much for that. Thank you to all of our panelists. I hope that we can give them all a great round of applause. That was a great discussion.